afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Collective for Equality Summit and this panel discussion on allyship in the workplace. My name is Beatrix Eder, and I'm a transformational coach and facilitator. I support my clients in practicing inclusive leadership at work and at home. Today, we live in a very interconnected world with a hybrid work environment. And that requires that we have skills to effectively collaborate with people who have a different identity and different experience from us. Now, to do this effectively, we need to be aware of our power, rank, and privilege so that we can really step into allyship and advocacy. Okay? So I would like to thank Vishwesh Iyer for organizing this summit and for his continuous support in advancing gender equity across the region. I'm very happy to be here as the moderator of this panel discussion, and I really appreciate the diversity that we have here in terms of gender, race, cultural background, and with the three other panelists who I would like to introduce to you right now. So we have Purvi Sheth, who is the managing director of Shilputsi Consultants, one of the most mature management consulting firms in India. Purvi also serves on the boards of other organizations, and she is part of POSH committees, which work on the prevention of sexual harassment. Good to have you here, Purvi. Purvi, you're muted.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Beatrix.
Thank you. Then we have our second panelist, Seah, who is the head of communication and marketing in APAC at DB Schenker. And gender equity and allyship are meaningful to him, not only as a father of 3 teenage daughters, but also as a leader in a company that wants to give all genders equitable access to opportunities. Thanks for being with us today, Andrew.
Thanks, Beatrix. You've let on my age.
Thank you. And certainly last but not least, Adrian Warr, who is the CEO of Southeast Asia and APAC at Edelman, the largest public relations firms in the world by revenue. Adrian has been championing gender equity through various programs and over several years. And recently, he has been recognized by the American Chamber of Commerce as a champion for advancement of women. So welcome to this panel discussion, Adrian. We're very excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you all. So to all those people who are listening and joining us, there is on the right side, you have a Q&A panel. So whenever you want to share something or ask a question, just type your question there. I will regularly check. And then you can also direct your question at one of the panelists if you would like Andrew, Adrian, or Purvi specifically to respond to your question. Okay, so as I was preparing for this discussion, I had to think back on the past 2-3 years that have been actually pretty challenging wherever we are in the world. There have been huge disruptions at all levels of society. And as we have witnessed COVID and Black Lives Matter, I think more and more people understand how we all play a role in larger movements of social justice, both at an individual level and at an organizational level. And when it comes to gender equity, I think there are 3 things that I would like to highlight and that have become more clear over the past few years. So first of all, there is a strong link between gender equity at work and in society. The former is not possible without the latter. Okay. A second thought is that gender equity is not just a woman's issue. That's the way it has been presented in the past, but I think this is changing and that's quite necessary. And gender equity and allyship concerns both women and men, because all genders are hurt by rigid and outdated gender norms and systems of domination. And the third thought I had was that gender equity is not a zero-sum game, okay? So it's not just girls and women who will benefit from a more equitable society. Such a message is, of course, helpful in encouraging men to be allies and advocates, and we definitely do need that. Such a message also reinforces this masculine code of doing and fixing and helping, and I get the sense that it takes away a little bit of agency from the women. So it still perpetuates these strict gender norms. So I wanted to touch on these foundational elements of gender equity and allyship. And so again, I encourage you to ask your questions. And I think, did I see something here, messages?
I am so sorry, Beatrix. My internet just...
Oh, you dropped.
I am so sorry about that. And I missed about 3-4 minutes of what you were saying.
No worries.
I am so sorry.
You know the theme quite well. What I'm looking here is that I don't have the Q&A panel anymore. So I have the people, I have the messages. That's interesting.
It's just next to the chat message icon. It's Q&A on the top right.
Yeah, I have people, I have messages, and I have alerts.
It's below that, the row below that. So there's manage, chats, and Q&A.
Oh yes, sorry, there was a pop-up thing which
right.
covered it. Okay. Q&A, there is no questions so far. So maybe let's start. I was wondering about Adrian. So I know that for you, gender equity is something where you want to get more men involved, and you also want to create a more collaborative and empowering approach in which both women and men are equal partners and allies. Can you share a little bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm lucky enough to belong to a group called Male Allies, which is an initiative under the Women's Foundation put together for the purpose of trying to get more men engaged in gender equality. So if you think about it, as you said, totally agree in your introduction, this is not a single gender issue. It's not a women's issue. It's an issue that affects absolutely everyone. However you really identify from a gender point of view, it affects us all. And yet the conversation obviously has historically been dominated by women. And it has been a conversation that's based around concepts of antagonism and the good and the bad and clash of genders. It's also an issue where through persistent inequality, we have a system that's dominated by men, just statistically. Yeah. I'm not, accusing men of some evil conspiracy. I don't necessarily believe that. I think it's much more complicated, but the fact is that the vast majority of board positions, the vast majority of government positions are held by men. And these are the positions in which policies can be changed in order to achieve more equality. So if we want to reach decision makers who can actually have substantive change, then we really need to get hold of those men and get them on board and get them to understand what we're grappling with. Then I think the third and final point as to why we need to get men involved is this is a cultural issue, and you can't change culture without numbers. You've got to be able to change popular opinion in order to be able to drive change. If you think about where change tends to come from, it tends to come from business and politics.
Yes.
Businesses make decisions that are profitable. Politicians make decisions that are popular. People often quote Scandinavia and Northern Europe as being amazing places because they have such great policies. Those policies didn't come about just because they've got great governments. There was culture change first that laid the pathway for those policies to change. So I think you've got to get men involved for all those reasons. And I think in terms of how we engage them, we've got to make it accessible to someone that has spent a while trying to get involved in and advocate for gender equality. It is intimidating if you're a man, simply because we very aptly have imposter syndrome. We don't really know what we're talking about. We have bundles of privilege that we've enjoyed throughout life, and we've not usually experienced a great deal of oppression or challenge. And so we have to learn. And yet the general narrative around gender equality is what we're doing wrong. And that's right. We are doing an awful lot wrong, but we've got to move beyond that into what we can do better and what the results of that are and why it's good for us all. So we've got to shift the conversation away from it being punitive and divisive and into something that's engaging, where there's an incentive for more men to want to get involved, because what we're talking about here in gender equality, but I think, from an intersectional point of view, in all forms of equality, is creating a better, fairer, happier, more balanced world. So we've got to switch away from the negative, I think, and into more of the positive.
I really like what you're saying of moving. You didn't use this word, but going from the either or perspective to a yes and, that it's not either man benefiting from all and having the strong positions in the world and in business and at home, but it should be a yes and, man and women.
That's right.
So thanks a lot, Adrian.
Yeah, no problem.
Andrew, what are some of the key focus areas at DB Schenker? DB Schenker is a company in freight forwarding and logistics. So traditionally, it's a very male-dominated industry. How does DB Schenker do that today?
Yeah, well, I think before I touch on what the company does, I just wanted to add further with what Adrian has shared. Adrian has very eloquently put it across in terms of what the challenges are as a privileged male, for instance, how we have been conditioned and what we've been doing is not a consequence of it's not a consequence of a short period of time. It has been generations of conditioning and socio-cultural architecturing that has evolved to what it is today. And while things are not perfect, I think lots of steps have been taken to improve things. And I just wanted to say that adding on to what Adrian was talking about, a lot of social justice advocacy. And it's not about advocating for another group, but it's advocating with another group, and that's all part and parcel of the allyship. And before we get to allyship, or to the level that effective allyship would bring beyond performative or just token actions to have real meaningful impact. It is really about turning on that switch, right, of self-awareness. And yesterday's session on unconscious bias really has that nice inflow towards what we're talking about today, right? And it's not easy to have that to have that level of self-awareness.
Andrew,
to turn it on.
You just made the difference between allyship and performative allyship. I'm not sure if all the people joining this conversation are familiar with this difference. Can you maybe elaborate and just make it clear how they are different?
Sure. I mean, I think allyship is not a single action, right? It is a continuous, sustainable action, a relationship with the parties that you are supporting, right? Whereas I think performative allyship is more focused on putting myself in the hot seat, right? It's more of the role of public relations, tokenism, trying to make it look good without much thought and consequence of, hey, are you really making an impact? So performative is really very at a superficial level. A lot of corporate washing, whether it's greenwashing, corporate washing, things to that extent that touches the surface. Is, hey, look, I'm doing really good. Hey, look at me, and that sort of stuff. So we're really going on a different level. Yeah.
One example is when sometimes companies communicate a lot about their efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion on social media. Yes. And then when you look, at Glassdoor comments or gender pay gap, and then they're not really walking the talk. So is that what you mean with
precisely? It's like
allyship.
Yes, and people are starting to get aware, right? Like recently in International Women's Day, people are looking at, hey, you're talking a lot about proportion of board representation, proportion of management representation, and so on and so forth. But are you really walking the talk? How's the gender pay gap and that sort of stuff, right? Now, this sounds a little bit like a oxymoron, because now I'm going to talk about what the company does. Not actively, not purposely, but using that as an example. So pardon me, right? So you mentioned earlier about the freight forwarding and logistics industry. I think it is very obvious, it is well known that it is it was very male dominated, right? From right down in the operations, where in the past, you had workers moving goods, moving cargo. Naturally, it was a very labor-intensive activity, right? And then as things became more complicated, more sophisticated and more complex with technology and all that, you have a lot of white collar jobs, very professional people talking about algorithms and IT and that sort of stuff, right? So, however, I mean, the organization also has evolved a lot since then, being a European multinational, right? So I've been with the company 15 years, and when I first joined, yes, representation was not equally distributed, and likewise, when you apply any of these principles of bias, I think everyone goes through that, right? So as an Asian male, there is also that awareness that, oh, okay, the environment is different. How can you correlate that, right? So similarly, in any forms of bias, prejudice, or situations where there are social inequality, that's where you start triggering the how do you say, the self-awareness. Okay.
Yes,
so
it's a long way to go, and I guess it starts first with some awareness, but then it definitely needs commitment.
Of course.
Commitment to, and the courage to keep going, even as things do not change from one day to the other.
Of course.
I would like to turn to Purvi. So Purvi, your company Shilputsi Consultants is advising your clients on how to hire, engage, and retain talent. Now, as Adrian also mentioned, and I think Andrew also said it, a big percentage of leadership positions, I don't know if it's 70 or 80 or over 80%, are occupied across the world by men. So how do you inspire often your male clients and partners to push boundaries and to be allies for gender equity?
Great question. And I think when we were talking yesterday, Beatrix, it's very hard for a lot of males to even understand sometimes what some of these issues are, and that I was mentioning, and even Adrian was, that one is the tokenism and the other is actually performative action. And that's where 50% of people, right, learn about allyship through other people's negative experiences. And the idea is to help them understand what these negative experiences could be. The world in itself has changed quite a lot. When my mother started Shilputsi Consultants in 1978, the journey that she had, the challenges and the barriers that she had as the first woman to start a business in human resources, very different from my journey per se, and for a lot of women who have started their journeys much later. However, there are barriers, and the idea is to help companies, organizations, and leaders listen and learn. And I think those two are very, very important, because like Adrian was saying, sometimes you don't know. It's the imposter syndrome. You're kind of going along with what you've heard. But how do you get them to experience what's going on with the other side and the other gender, right? And listening is a big part of that. Listening to what women are saying or what allyship can do for the organization and for the culture of the corporate world itself. Very, very important. We hold a lot of talks around this. We do a lot of experiential seminars around this, and actually help companies transform. It's not an overnight situation. Allyship is an iterative process, right? It's not a one-time event. We need to keep doing this over and over again. We do it through various programs. We do it through our advisory services. And sometimes we see that it's taking more time than we'd like, but we see some great impact of change as well.
Yes, yes. Wonderful what you're saying. It's about really understanding how other people experience reality that might be different from ours. And I think the most difficult thing is that as human beings, we presume that our reality applies also to others. And it's very easy to forget that actually it's not.
Absolutely. And I think, there are two things. Lily Tomlin had a very interesting quote saying, I wondered why somebody didn't do something. till I realized I was that somebody. Right? And that's what it is. We need to realize what we can do. And a lot of men feel today that, are we paying for the sins of the generations of men who actually made things very difficult? In some ways, perhaps yes. In some ways, maybe not. You're moving forward. You're not looking through the rearview mirror, and that's really the change we need to bring. Stop looking at the rearview mirror, but to look forward in allyship.
Yes, yes. Thanks for sharing, Purvi. So we have a question in the Q&A column from Girish, and Girish is asking, without specifying which person he's asking, but the question is, how do you think we can bring about social change where allyship can become an intuitive process? I'll let you decide who feels.
I'm happy to jump in on that. I'm happy to jump in on that. And also I'd love to sort of touch back on something that Andrew said that I think was interesting and worth noting as well. But first off, to answer that question, or just give a perspective on it rather than answer it. I mean, there are aspects of how we can create a society and people that are predisposed to being more open and understanding and tolerant.
Yeah.
And I think that can come through education, through politics, through how we build culture, through our families, through all manner of things. But ultimately, most forms of allyship require somebody who has had a certain set of life experiences to try and empathize with someone who has had a very, very different set of life experiences, and to be able to try and create a fair environment for both to exist. It tends to involve crossing a barrier of understanding and experience that mean that I think it is very rarely going to be intuitive. I think you can create an instinct for people to want to do that, and we could do that a lot better. I think on a personal level, it was very easy in my upbringing in the world I've grown up in to turn a blind eye to the privilege that I've enjoyed, to the extent that I got to 35 years old. Stop it. Thank you. You're too kind. And was still really not doing very much about this issue until sort of 6-7 years ago, because it just had not been something that my workplace, my university or my education had placed a priority on me playing a role in fixing.
Yep.
The narrative throughout my education had been that this is an unfortunate thing and it's very hard to fix and governments will do it, or someone else.
And that's the way it is.
And that's the way it is. And that's the way it is. And that's made it very, very easy for me to turn a blind eye to it all and enjoy my privilege. And, you know, to your point, Purvi, I think it's very interesting that someone will talk about, are we paying for the sins of previous generations? Might be standing on the shoulders of previous generations who've allowed us to achieve an enormous amount of privilege for absolutely nothing. But, you know, I think we are beneficiaries of that because there's a system which hasn't necessarily, an education system that hasn't prompted the fact that those of us who have privilege owe it to the rest that pay it back. In fact, we have systems of, I think, capitalism and education in large parts of the Western world that tell us that we deserve our privilege, that we've earned it.
I love what you're saying, Adrian. This is so important. I wish we could have it, you know, in text, big, red, bold, and printed, because this is such a core thing in all this issue, not just around gender equity, but in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think being an ally and an advocate is certainly not for the faint of heart, because it involves confronting issues, it involves confronting people, and especially it involves confronting ourselves. So I'm curious again, maybe to start with you, Adrian. What difficult situations have you faced, and how did you step into your courage to go through these situations despite the challenge and despite the discomfort?
Well, that's where this initiative Male Allies has been immensely helpful. I had very little idea how to get into this. I got into advocating for gender equality through a combination of factors within my personal life that drove me to want to get involved, because the unfairness was thrown very much in my face when we were adopting our kids. The adoption system and social services is massively weighted towards families who have a male working parent and a female parent that gives up work. Statistically built into the system, and so that struck me as very unfair. At the same time, I run a business that's predominantly female, and we have a huge group of women at a certain level. So from a commercial and personal point of view, wanted to get involved, but I had no idea what to do. But luckily, was in discussions with the Women's Foundation about creating a platform to help idiots like me learn how to get involved without messing it up or jumping into thinking that we've got all the solutions and can fix things. You know, it's really the whole drive of Male Allies is and the motto of it is listen, learn, act.
Yes.
And that's really what it's about, right? It's not about necessarily providing solutions. And sometimes it's just about understanding and staying out the way or creating a fair environment. In terms of the difficult situations I've dealt with, I mean, so many, and still deal with them and still mess lots of them up all the time. I think the hardest for a lot of men, and this comes back again, I think, to something that I'd love to touch on that Andrew said at the start, but one of the hardest situations for men is actually doing this outside of work with your friends. You know, it's the locker room jokes, it's your mate saying things that are inappropriate, and you be an active bystander and saying, no, that's not actually very funny. You know, don't do that anymore. I fail on that plenty of times still, and it's very, very hard.
Quick question. So these locker room jokes, do these situations bring up a fear that if you speak up for what you think is right, it might bring a risk to the relationship?
I don't think it's a risk to the relationship. I think it's usually in the moment, whether you are. For me, it's whether oftentimes it's a judgment that you're doing in a split second as to whether it's going to make any difference at all. Are you bringing it up in that moment? And usually it's not. Usually it's something I would bring up later. Because if you are with a group of guys and they're making that joke and you point out the fact that it's deeply inappropriate, a lot of the time you're actually just going to be met with a reaction of, oh, come on, stop being such a fun sponge.
Exactly.
It's obviously a joke. It's obviously well-intentioned. To get someone to a point of understanding why that well-intentioned joke is actually harmful is a lot more than just pointing it out. That's a long and tortuous conversation, frankly. So it's often that equation, but usually, yeah, it's cowardice. Usually it's not wanting to make a scene or draw attention to yourself. And I do it as much as I can, and sometimes I fail miserably. But I think this goes to a point that Andrew made, which is about performative activism. And I have a bit of a hobby horse on this one as well, in that especially the industry I work in communications. I help a lot of companies try and devise platforms about their DE&I journeys or their sustainability journeys. And I help an awful lot of them that come under a massive attack as well. And I think we should call out people that are doing this for the wrong reasons. We should call out people that fail. However, I think nobody's perfect. Case in point, as I'm saying, I fail plenty of the time at getting this right, and no company is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
If we attack people who have at least put out a target or said something that they want to improve, or set out an intention to do better, or created goals, even if they're failing, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we attack people like that, as opposed to the people who are doing absolutely nothing and hiding. And I think we as a group love doing that. We absolutely love finding a company or a group that we can find a chink in their armor and then call them hypocrites. And I think it's a dangerous line that we cross. I absolutely agree with you, Andrew. We should call it out. It shouldn't be tolerated. We don't want greenwashing. We don't want performative activism. I think that we sometimes stray into kicking people for hypocrisy instead of actually looking at the vast number of people that are doing nothing.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, I totally resonate with what Adrian has said, and just to bring it on that a little bit on what the question was talking about, intuitive process. Intuitive meaning instinctive, and muscle memory actually comes about when you have all these years and generations of institutional, structural, systemic reinforcement. So like Adrian, boys talk and that sort of stuff. When you were younger, you certainly maybe you were very much influenced, and you're still forming your value systems, for instance. And even up to today, sometimes I err into the mansplaining sphere very frequently, and I get reminded quite actively by my daughters that Dad, you're mansplaining. So I get overruled quite a bit at home, but I appreciate that, because that really then fine tunes your self-awareness. Because until that point in time where you are able to see things out, as what Adrian was talking about, when you're with a bunch of good mates, and when you're talking about this, when conversations sphere into things that may be a bit uncomfortable, the level of empathy that you have to suddenly trigger is, how would this be perceived when this is talked about with family members, with your own female family members, right? So I mean, you can't detach that, because someone is always someone else's sister, mother, daughter,
or just a
spouse.
female friend.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Andrew and Adrian, since you are the guys on this call, and Adrian, you're even in the industry of communication, and you mentioned how important it is to call out these instances. And I fully agree with you. Now, what I often see when I have coaching sessions with my clients, that they know they should call it out, and they do not know how it's possible. How can they do it in a way that is what I call effective, that you call it out and ideally you maintain the relationship? So do you, Andrew and Adrian, have some, best practice on this?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure, Andrew, you got lots as well. I mean, I think that I wouldn't say there's necessarily best practice. I've got some experience, and I've had some training on active bystanding, which I think has given some useful advice. Some of the things that I've learned from that, and I think you need to treat a situation where you are calling something out like that sensitively, because what you are doing in calling it out is you're almost in some ways accusing someone of doing something wrong. And so I think it needs to be done with an understanding of the nature of de-escalation. It needs to be done calmly and quietly and quite softly and nicely. It's not a productive approach to make someone try to feel bad for what they've said. What you want to be doing is trying to get them to question what they've said or think about what they've said. You don't want to necessarily go into it thinking, I'm going to get an apology out of this person or get them to admit they're wrong. To that end, I think a useful tool is actually not so much calling it out as asking questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Often when I'll hear a joke that's really inappropriate, I'll just say, oh my goodness, do you think those kind of jokes are still funny these days? They kind of make me feel awkward. That kind of approach.
Yes, this is a very good wording.
Yeah, it's non-threatening, and it's easy for people to kind of meet you halfway and say, yeah, well, I mean, I think it's funny, but I get what you mean, right? You're allowing an open door for someone not to feel bad if you question. I think timing is also a key part of it. Sometimes in the moment is not the best thing, like calling someone out, especially in Asia Pacific.
Yes.
Calling someone out in a public situation where they could be seen in front of others.
Losing face.
Wrong. Yeah, it is extremely ineffective, I think. When you're advanced on this, or when you do it a lot, I've read some interesting books about how you can use humor. Humor is an immensely disarming way of doing things, and I think you've got to be very, very careful using humor to do it. But I think it can be done, and I think where you're in a situation where people are trying to be funny, meeting them back with humor again, I think can be effective. But look,
for this, I guess
lying if I said I perfected any of these things, I still find it super hard.
Yes, I hear what you're saying with humor. I think it can be a little bit risky when there are different languages. So let's say if you're a native English speaker and you speak to someone who is not a native English speaker, and cultural differences, then humor can, go into a different direction. But what you seem to say, and please correct me if it's wrong, that when you call out something, you want to call out the behavior and not the person. So you don't want to imply that the person is a bad person, but you just want to say that, look, what you just said or did, that was not really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think what you're trying to do is focus on the thought or the concept, not them.
Yeah.
Not even how they delivered it. It's getting them to question the premise of maybe what they've said that I think is probably more effective, so that it doesn't feel like an attack or a criticism directly of the human.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. I would want to go back to Purvi again, because you're working with a lot of organizations, giving them advice, and I want to be practical here so that the people who are listening to us can really walk away with some actions on the individual level, what they can do. And now I would like to focus a little bit on what organizations can do to, increase allyship and to become more inclusive and more equitable at their structures and policies.
Thanks. Thanks, Beatrix. I was listening to the male perspective, and I'm going to set a little bit of the cat among women here. I think it's interesting that we talk about allyship and we talk about, let's say, mansplaining or jokes. Adrian and Andrew made some very interesting points around that. But, when we talk about women pushing boundaries and workplace equity, right? I think we've got to move a little beyond jokes and mansplaining. Those are there, but I think there are bigger issues that we need to talk about around workplace equity and how to bring that about. And while we can change cultural nuances around jokes or how people communicate some of their thoughts, what we really do need to do is change cultures at an organizational level. Since you asked about what organizations can do. First of all, in my view, allyship, and Beatrix, you're going to have to forgive me for this one, but I think allyship in some ways can tend to be a patronizing, condescending phrase. It's about one section trying to do something to the other section. If we're talking about workplace equity, right, we need more partnership than just allyship. That's the first thing that I would say to organizations, that look at allyship as partnership, where there is a giver and there's a taker, and both have to give and take equally. And it's not just among men and women, it's among women and women as well, and it's among men and men as well. So allyship needs to transfer itself a little bit now in the modern corporate context to partnership, where we're closing gaps and we're changing equations, right?
Yeah.
That's where partnership will move towards, or that's where allyship, the future of allyship, needs to move towards. So that's my first, and that's what I would actually encourage organizations to do. I run a program called License to Lead, and it's a program for women leaders. And I run another program called Ascendancy, which is for women and male leaders. And the idea is for allyship to build across genders, across levels of leadership as well. So you need to look at allyship as a 360-degree process. And again, for organizations, allyship doesn't just happen at a peer level in the organization or at a higher level in the organization. Teams need to see how they can ally with their bosses. Peers at home, spouses, partners need to see how they can become great allies so that you can push workplace boundaries, you can bring in more equity. And that's something I think that organizations need to do a little better today. And that's the other advice. And finally, I think it's a little bit of communicating and listening. I think organizations have a narrative around what's needed, right? We have a narrative around what needs to be done. Do we listen enough? Do we check it enough to say, is this what is needed? I don't think a lot of women in the corporate world today, and I don't know about the listener profile, but I think the listener profile of today, for example, isn't at the lowest level of the Maslow's hierarchy on workplace equity. We've moved a little beyond that. We're not just looking for, like 20 years ago, there were companies and factories in India which would not have toilets for women. I think we've moved a little beyond that around what is needed in allyship. Do we as organizations listen enough to them? And that, I think, is something that organizations need to do more of, to listen to what is needed for allyship, and that changes over the period of time, and we need to keep listening. So that's the third thing that I would say to organizations.
Yes, Purvi, listening is so super important. Listening, and I think in an organizational context also measuring, because just listening, it becomes anecdotal stories. But to create real change, we need to have numbers. How is something now? And where do we want to create change? And how do we create that change? So listening and measuring, and then of course knowing what do we do with the numbers. Having numbers is one thing, but you need to act on them. We have 2 questions coming in, so I will just read the first one. Chandra is asking, how can we make education gender sensitive, especially in countries like India? Who would like to respond?
I'm assuming since I'm the Indian here.
Yes, makes sense.
I didn't see Andrew or Adrian jump out at that one.
Not an expert in education, probably not an expert in India. I definitely defer to you, Purvi.
Adrian, I'd love to hear your views on education. And I am not an expert on education, but I know a little bit about India. I think, I'm sorry, can you just go back to the question again?
Yes, I guess you don't see the question?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay. Allow me to read it one more time. So how can we make education gender sensitive, especially in countries like India?
So, I think the education system in India, it has never been very gender sensitive. But I'm not sure in history, too many places where education has actually been as gender sensitive as we know about gender sensitivity today. I think we need to start at the bottom to say, when we look at textbooks, when we look at the way authors write in textbooks, the stories we choose in English literature or Indian literature, do they portray women and men on the same platform? I think it has to start at that level, and there's going to be a lot of government intervention that's going to be needed there, a lot of advocacy that's going to be needed for us to be able to change that. And I think that's going to be where we start changing. It can't happen at just the micro level. It needs to happen at a macro level, and we need a lot more public policy and a lot more public outcry around some of these things to bring this change. Social change won't happen otherwise, in my view. And this is a social change.
I think, Purvi, that's probably true, not only for India. I see so many strict gender roles in infancy already across the world, so even in Europe. And if I may just add on this, certainly not with the India-specific context, but just the gender role context. So what we can do in education, Purvi mentioned that the family is the first unit of society. And so one thing I think is, for example, that we don't put our kids into gender roles, dressing girls in pink and boys in blue. Not allowing, so my son had a phase when he loved wearing skirts. And I was totally okay with that. And I know that some people were smiling like, oh, why is he wearing skirts? And I said, you know what, he's just playing, and let him try it out. Or there's some things that we do very inadvertently. So again, I take just one example from my own family, and I will pass it on to Andrew and Adrian if they want to add something. So automatically, my husband used to call my daughter my little princess. And then we had a discussion like, is that what you want? Do you want to raise her into a little princess, who is weak and waiting to be chosen and saved? And then we became aware of this, and he stopped saying that. So now he's calling our daughter my little pirate.
I think I could definitely relate to that. I think for the topic of education, it is really institutional and systemic, because in a large part, when education is being conducted, there's also the cultural and language element, right? And certain languages are still very, whether it's European languages or even Asian languages, there are very distinct lines drawn between the female and the male subjects, right? So I think, and even beyond India, I mean, for the rest of Asia Pacific, in which I play in, conservative societies are the dominant ones within Asia Pacific, and it is not something that we can just quickly change overnight and expect immediate results. And even leading on to what Adrian was the questions before about how do we call them out? We can't call them out straight away. We have to understand the environment, and that's why we talk about the empathy and even empathy of the people who are maybe not aware what the circumstances are around that gave rise to this, right? So we have to play within the rules and then effect that change slowly. And allyship is not a one-time thing. It's a journey. It's a continuous journey. And then through education, whether it's institutional or within social environments, when we engage with our friends, that education also has to prevail, right?
So I think there's an important. I mean, I don't know a huge amount about education. My dad was a teacher, and so that gives you something. I really don't know a great deal about education. Something that from books that I've read and my experience of having children is that education is absolutely vitally important, but I think probably making enormous strides in many areas. I think the family unit is one thing, and that depends on that particular family's sense of values, religion, and all sorts of others. But ultimately, in terms of the psychology of our children, right, they are feeling a safety within the family. But what they're learning to do as they grow up is they're learning how to fit into a tribe, because we're tribal animals. What they're doing, therefore, is they're following normative processes. So they're looking at what are the commonalities between those individuals. Since my kids are 3 or 4 and started going to school up until now, without a doubt, by far the greatest influence, beyond us and beyond whatever school will say, is popular culture and what they're seeing on TV and what they're seeing around them and the toys that they get. And there is outrageous sexism that's being programmed into them through what they're watching on TV, what they're reading in the comics that they're getting. And we turn a blind eye to it. But that is, again, systemic. You have people in product development departments deciding what is going to be good for a young girl's film and what is going to be good for a young boy's film, and designing products around what will sell better to boys versus girls, rather than focusing on what gives a normal version of what gender roles should play. I mean, yes, they will try and argue now that programs such as Paw Patrol are designed for both genders. It's 4 cool dogs and then 1 pink dog. It is absolutely not a real depiction of gender, right? If you look at, my kids are now massively into any of the Marvel movies. I mean, again, tokenistic approaches to try and display the fact that there are 2 genders in there, an absolutely unrealistic portrayal of both. Also striking, by the way, when you look at, there's a correlation here, female board participation in major industries, popular culture, media, music, film, lowest board participation of women in most industries. And it's very, very striking. If you look at most of the sort of marketing of fashion that's even going out to teens, if you look at the music industry and movies and TV, I think that's a massive influence, absolutely huge, and not talked about perhaps as much as it could be.
Yeah. Well, and
if I can just also
that will change.
I agree with that. With social media and advertising, you see advertising, for example, in India, constantly showing the woman with the household responsibilities, and those advertisements that show a working woman are lauded as open and thinking smart advertisements. They're par for course. They're normal advertisements, but those are the ones that are showcased to say, oh, look, these are the great advertisements. And there are probably 90% of ads which show women in very stereotypical gender roles in India.
Yeah.
And that affects, of course, a mindset across, especially in the deeper pockets of the country, where social change is much slower than it is in the urban areas.
Yeah. I think also leading on to that, when we spoke about education, not just at the children level and as they develop, it goes into, for example, why female representation in STEM subjects, and then further on to that in professions in STEM. And if you look at it across companies, for example, there are stereotypes in that certain departments or functions are more male-dominated than others, whether it's engineering, whether it's human resources, finance and IT. So that really is the start where it starts to snowball down the supply chain.
And as you all say through these examples, it permeates our culture, whether in India or in Asia Pacific or the Western world. And Andrew, earlier you said that allyship is a journey, and I just want to connect. We have another question that came in on this theme. So Kalai Shelvi, I hope I pronounced this name correctly, is asking, is allyship an identity or a process? Is allyship self-defined? I am posing this question to Purvi. So Purvi, would you like to respond?
Allyship is a state of mind. Allyship is about the way you're thinking. It's a commonality of values and thought process ultimately. And therefore, if that's the way you think, that becomes automatically your identity. You take that on as who you are. Um, and I think once you've done that, you constantly indulge in the process of allyship. Then allyship becomes a way of being, it becomes a way of life. You're not even conscious of it, you're not even aware of it. It's not about correcting someone, it's not about consciously trying to bring change. You are the change. So when you are that, and you people know that things cannot go past you unless they're in the right tonality or they're in the right form or the right framework, you become a part of allyship yourself. So it's, and self-defined, yes, each one defines what allyship means to themselves. Today, I would define allyship as, like I was mentioning earlier, partnership. To me, it's not about upliftment and not about trying to take a section and going, especially in the context of what we're talking about today, which is workplace equity. It's not about doing somebody a favor. It's about us all working together. And like I've mentioned before, men and women, men and men, women and women, and all other genders working together to bring in workplace equity. And, the more we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, we're probably doing a little bit of a disservice there because it stays a theoretical discussion. The more we start taking allyship as a persona, we're actually making and bringing change. So that's my view.
I think this is so beautiful what you're saying, Purvi, that you start doing things and then it becomes your identity. So maybe it will start with one action, and that one action becomes a habit or a process. And over time, this is what I would call transformation, how we change our, understanding and view of things. Yeah. Adrian or Andrew, would you like to add anything on allyship as an identity or a process?
So I think.
Oh, sorry, go on, Andrew.
Great. I think what when you sort of push that question to me, Beatrix, I agree completely with Purvi's position, and hers was very fluid. Right? For me, allyship was we wanted to move away from another label, and what the world doesn't need is another label. It has, we are looking more towards verbs now, actions, so that we can actually make that change effectively and be on that journey rather than having more labels. So certainly an identity is part and parcel of that. You have to have the identity before you start taking the action, but it has to be more fluid. It shouldn't be something that and then we become one of those keyboard warriors starting to flame people for saying the wrong things, as what Adrian alluded to, and that doesn't help the conversation, because while people may have slipped, and God knows we are not perfect, people do slip. Even well-intentioned, even with all the well-intentions, they slip, and then suddenly the whole culture becomes very toxic. Although it's supposed to purport something that is positive and pushing for more diversity of thought. Yeah.
Labels can help us to identify things and to become aware of them. But as you say, if they become very strict and rigid, it's in the end, it's a judgment, even when it is a positive label. And I think if we want to create a more inclusive and more equitable world at workplaces and in society, we want to move away from judgment and just open up to curiosity and acceptance.
That's right. Yeah. And I jumped in before Adrian, so Adrian, please.
Yes, Adrian.
No. I was just going to say that I thought that Purvi had kind of summarized it perfectly. The only thing I was going to add was, I suppose, in the second part of the process, something that I think is useful as an approach to this. So in terms of practically the act part of listen, learn, and then act, I think we, in training in male allies, we try and learn to think about circles of influence of being a male ally. The first being kind of yourself and introspection and understanding what you do, behaviors that you display, your own thought patterns, learning your own unconscious bias, which I think anyone can do. And I think that's sort of, that's the base of it. If a lot more men just did that, then I think we'd make a lot of progress just in terms of better understanding. Then the next sphere of influence is sort of your family and friends, the people that are around you. It might be, helping relatives from a different generation just change how they think. It could be friends that you're hanging around with, people that you meet at dinner parties, that sort of just your social life, your contacts that you're close with. The next circle is kind of your colleagues, your workplace, the people you work with directly. And then the next circle is potentially changing your business as a whole if you have the ability to affect policy. And then finally is advocating publicly. I don't think anyone has to do all of those things or even lots of them in order to be an ally. I think thinking about them practically can make it more manageable to go from just thinking about the issue as being terribly unfair to actually doing something. And I think that's the key part of being a male ally or an ally in any area, as Purvi said, is actually in some ways that the distinction is someone that's just switched to doing something about it. If you are on the lucky side of privilege, as I certainly am, it's recognizing that you're in that position and doing something about it for those that perhaps don't enjoy that privilege. So it's the sense of action. And I think thinking about those circles of influence can make it a little bit more approachable and bite-sized to work out what you can do.
Adrian, that's again such a golden nugget that you were saying on how do we engage with our privilege. So again, what seems to happen often when people first start engaging with or recognizing their power and seeing how privileged they are for things that they were taking for granted, it often first induces shame and guilt. Like, okay, I'm a male, I'm white, I'm able-bodied, I'm educated and all that. Is it my fault? No, it's not a fault. And shame and guilt are very alienating and isolating feelings, so and disempowering feelings. So I loved what you said, that how do you engage with your privilege? You cannot take it off. It's not a coat that you can put on a hanger and then take a less privileged coat, but you can choose to engage, to use your privilege to the benefit of all. And I just realized that we are coming to the end of this session. I know, Chandra, there was a question from you specifically to Purvi on how effective is POSH, but we will need to wrap up. So maybe you can reach out to Purvi via LinkedIn and ask, how she's involved in POSH and how effective it is.
I've just answered that question, Chandra, but yes, happy to connect on LinkedIn and delve deeper into that discussion.
Yes, so I wanted to thank my three panelists, Adrian, Andrew, and Purvi, to make time for this conversation. I think it was really juicy, and we touched on a lot of topics of gender equity, of allyship, of bringing a more collaborative approach and moving away from the either or binary and judgmental thinking. I also appreciate that we had several questions and that we took time to have several perspectives on the questions. So all the people who have been watching us and listening to us, feel free to connect with us over LinkedIn. All four of us are passionate about gender equity, allyship, advocacy, and not just for men and women, but for all genders. So whoever is non-binary, gender fluid, or however they identify themselves, I think it's important to have workplaces and societies that people can just feel safe, have their agency, show up the way they are, and have access to equal resources and opportunities. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I wish you a happy weekend, and I look forward to staying in touch with you and having the next conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.